Hey friends, it's Risket, and in today's video I want to show you a method that I've been using to relight 2D images. Now I've been teasing this for a little bit on my YouTube shorts and my Instagram, basically finding it to be a really fast way of relighting a 2D image so that it can be further composited with another image, kind of like photo bashing. Now, it's been taking me a little while to make this video because there's so many different ways that you can kind of go about it. It's very open to experimentation. Some methods work better than others. Some photos work better than others. But I haven't really seen a lot of other people tackle this online. So I thought that I'd make a video about it, and hopefully you could follow along and kind of develop your own workflow from there. I think that in the next few years, technology like this could really sort of skyrocket. I have a feeling that it might. I'm hoping that it might. And so it's probably going to get easier. But at the time of making this video, this is kind of the best way I could find to go about it, using free tools. So today's video might wind up going on for a little bit, but I really want to show how this method works and why it works, and sort of the different tools that you can use to explore that, as well as the thing that inspired it. And then I want to jump into using Affinity Photo to completely relight a 2D image and composite it further. So there'll sort of be like a bit of a how this works at the beginning, and then we'll jump into a tutorial of how to actually do it yourself and how to use it. So a few months ago, a website called ClipDrop announced a tool called Relight, which allows you to enter in an image of a person and pretty much relight it. It's really, really fun to play around with, and the fact that it's free is really awesome. Now, the issue with Relight is that it doesn't really seem to work on scenes. So if you throw in an image of a person, it seems to work really, really well, and it does pick up their clothing and whatnot, which is really great, and you can use it with artworks. But if you throw in like a scene of a city or maybe some tools sitting on a bench, the effect doesn't work. So I got to thinking why this was, and I jumped into the About page and kind of read about the different models that they created and how they went about training the model in order for it to work. And in that, they sourced a couple of GitHub projects, but we'll get to that in a second. If you sign up for the paid version of this tool, it gives you access to download a couple of things. So not only can you download the image, but they also let you download a depth map, which is really useful, but we're not going to be using that today. And they also let you download a normal map. So for the uninitiated, in the 3D world, when you're modeling something, you're usually using normal maps a lot, use them a lot in gaming, and it's a really useful way to sort of control the lighting or fake lighting effects in 3D environments. So basically what this tool is doing is using an AI algorithm to project the surface normals of a 2D image. But we want to really be able to do this with just about anything. So I dug a little deeper and found a few free tools that do it. There was a lot of trial and error in using some of these. Some worked really great, some worked really terribly. But the one I found to work the best was an app called Omnidata. Now you can download this for free, and it's available on GitHub. I'll make sure I leave a link down below in the description. And this isn't going to be a tutorial of how to install that, because there's a lot of work involved in installing something like this. But fortunately, if you go to the Omnidata page, and I'll also leave a link to this, they include a web-based version of this. So you can just upload an image and it'll spit out a normal map for you. So we're nearly up to exploring how to use this in a tutorial, but let's just preface a couple of things. The normal map that Omnidata spits out is 512 by 512 pixels. It's not exactly pretty, and it's not as good as the one you would get from Relight if you use it on a portrait. However, we can use a couple of other tools to help sort of enhance it a little further, and we're going to be exploring that next before we jump into the main tutorial of how to use all of this stuff in Affinity Photo. So I'm going to jump onto the computer right now. We're going to open up a few different apps and sort of have a look at the different workflows we can go about in order to do all of this. So for today's image, we're going to be using this guy because I've used him before and it seemed to work really well the first time. However, if we feed this into Omnidata, which we're going to get into in a second, we're going to run into a couple of issues because Omnidata expects a square image at 512 by 512 pixel resolution. So we basically need to drop this entire image into that file size. So what we need to do is open up Affinity Photo. Now I'm using Affinity Photo 2 for this, but you can use the older version as well. There's really not that much difference, at least not for this workflow. Let's set pixels to 512 by 512 and hit create. Now what I want to do is drag in our original image, and we're just going to make sure that it fits inside this box. I'm just going to push it all the way over to the left here. Perfect. So we just need to export this. And now let's head over to Omnidata. So this is the Omnidata GitHub project. You can follow the instructions in this weights and PyTorch demo section here. It is a bit long-winded though, and if you don't have much experience in installing GitHub projects, you might find a little bit of difficulty, but we don't really want to get into all of that today. What you want to press on is the online demo. So this is the live demo where you can just upload an image using the choose file button and go from there. It does show you like a bunch of different images based off of other normal production apps and whatnot. But yeah, so what we want to do is hit choose file and load in our image. Great. Next, you want to hit I'm not a robot and then run inference. This might take a minute. And there we go. So basically this first one is the one that we want. You can also get the depth map and whatnot here, but don't select any of the others. What you want to do is right click this and go open image in new tab. And then once you've got that full size image there, just save it to where you want. So next up, let's come back to Affinity Photo. I'm going to just close out of this one for now, and we'll open up our original file. Great. Now let's drag our normal projection on there. And we're just going to scale it up until it fills the frame. And these should be lined up pretty good now. Now we can see that we don't have a lot of detail in this normal map. So as I said earlier, it's not exactly the prettiest example, but we're going to fix that in just a minute. What we want to do for now is press Ctrl-I on your keyboard, or alternatively go to the adjustments panel and select invert. So this is pretty much the color scheme that we need our normal map to be in. So let's have a quick play around with this and see if we can relight it using just this before we add in a lot of extra detail. So I'm going to click on our live filters down here, scroll all the way down to procedural texture, hit preset and scroll down to the bottom and select simple bump map lighting. So we've got a couple of options here. We've got this slider which lets us play around with the brightness, and we've also got this dial here which lets us change the lighting direction. So it's slightly inverted. Basically, if you drag this towards the left, it's going to illuminate the image from the right-hand side. And if you drag it towards the right, it'll illuminate it from the left-hand side. Going up will illuminate it from the bottom and down from the top. So I'm pretty sure if we just turn this off for a second, it looks like he's being lit from the left-hand side of the image. So most of the shadows are appearing on the right-hand side. So let's just flip it for now, and we'll make most of the lighting information come from the right-hand side. Something like that should do the job. Now, right now, this isn't exactly usable because obviously we can't see the colors of our original image. So we need to select this layer and we'll hit the blend mode options. Now, you can play around with these and pick the ones that suit your image the best. So sometimes playing around with color burn and linear burn can produce some really cool results. Most of the time, however, I'm finding that I toggle between soft light and hard light. Hard light's pretty full on, but if you control it right, you can get some really good results. For now, let's just go with soft light. So we can always open up our layer again and the procedural texture and move the lighting around. If we switch this blend mode to hard light, we can see that it really emphasizes the highlights and the shadows. And kind of, this is the one that I use the most because just controlling the brightness slightly can give you like a little bit more creative control. Maybe we'll shift this down a little bit. But then something else I like to do is go back to the original image and we'll just play around with the exposure and we'll decrease that slightly. Just so that the original image is, looking a little bit darker. I don't want too much lighting information in there, just something really dark. Then we'll turn on our procedural texture layer again, light it from this side, and play around with the brightness to sort of setting that you like. Maybe something like that. So now what we want to do is just make sure that with the blend options, and again, you can play around with this however you like. We could say that we don't want any of the shadows from this layer to be in there. And you can increase those highlights a little bit more. So basically what this is doing is getting rid of the shadows from the hard light layer and leaving the shadows that we've got with the underexposed image down the bottom. So this gives us a lot more creative freedom with how we want these highlights to be represented. Let's open up our procedural texture again and just play around with this a little bit more. Now, something else that I like to do when doing this method is to select the adjustments here and select the recolor option. Now, we want to make sure that this is sitting just above our procedural texture layer. There we go. Let's decrease the saturation slightly, and maybe we'll select something like, I don't know, orange sort of light. And now we can use this lightness slider to control how much of that is coming through. So, really take a look at his sleeve over here. You can see that it's fully in shadow, but as we increase this, we're bringing in some of that lighting information. What I'm thinking of doing is decreasing this exposure just a little bit more so that it's quite darkened out. And now what we can do is duplicate this layer. We'll change the recolor adjustment to a different color, maybe like a bluey sort of tint. And now let's move this light over onto the opposite side of him. Maybe something about there, and let's really knock out that brightness. So I just want to introduce that just a little bit. And I'm not really focusing on the building behind him at the moment. I'm mainly just looking at the subject because we're going to mask him out in a minute. Again, don't forget that you can come up to this top layer and play around with the blend options until you get the result that you're after. So we could really go for some sort of edge highlighting here, or we could introduce it a little bit more and make it a bit softer. So that is pretty much the main workflow that I've been using for a lot of this. But as you can see, we're not picking up really many details to do with his glasses or his face. There's a lot of weird jagged pixels around the place. This is quite messy. So let's explore a few different ways that we can increase the resolution of this, or at least make it a little bit more usable. Now, there are a lot of different tools out there that let you create normal maps, but they're mainly normal maps that are slightly flat and just used for quickly throwing in like a little bit of bump on wood grain or tiles that you can then import into a 3D program. So whereas the normal map that we created like this is kind of just projecting the surface normals using AI, what we want to do is just make a complete normal map of the original image. I know that sounds confusing, but bear with me. If you do a search for Gimp, and I'll leave a link to this down below in the description as well, you can download this program. So this is essentially like a free version of Photoshop. And yes, there are quite a lot of other programs out there that do what we're about to do, but I'm just finding Gimp to be probably the simplest for people to get their head around. So once you have Gimp open, it should look like this. Now what we want to do is import our image and keep the color information. Next up, we'll go to Filters, Generic, Normal Map. So we can see that this is essentially giving us a normal map, but it's not really giving us things like the shadows and the highlights per se. It's kind of just making a bit of a bump map. So it's picking out a lot of the details, which is pretty much what we want. But yeah, it's not going to do as good a job of relighting in Affinity. We're pretty much going to merge this with the normal map we got from omnidata. So what I'm going to do is pretty much leave everything as default, and we're going to export a copy of this. So again, let's bring in our normal map. Great. We'll press Ctrl I to invert the colors. And now let's bring in our Gimp map. And we'll just sit that on top. Now, what we want to do is using the blend modes, you can select whatever you like, but usually I find overlay, soft light, and hard light does the better job. Overlay and hard light can be a little bit too strong sometimes though, so maybe soft light is more up your alley. Now we can see we're still getting a lot of pixelation on him. A couple of different methods I've used to get around this issue is, of course, going to live filters and playing around with Gaussian blur, but usually I select medium blur because it kind of tends to, even though it rounds things out, it kind of tends to smooth things out in a more desirable way. So we can sort of see those highlights around his face if we push this really hard. It's not exactly a Gaussian blur, but it is getting rid of a lot of the aliasing. You do want to watch out for this though, because we can see it's evening out, for example, this section around his nose and his lips. So if you're still not finding Gaussian blur to work, you could try, if you're still not finding medium blur to work, you should try Gaussian blur. Again though, this can produce some pretty crazy results, so yeah, use it wisely. One other method that I've been exploring is using an app called Upscayl, and unlike most GitHub projects, this one's really easy to install. You pretty much download it and run an exe file, and you get a very simple upscaling program. Once you have Upscayl open, you can just drag in the image you want to upscale, and you only have a couple of options. You can switch between a general photo, digital art, or just a way to sharpen the image. For this, I'm just going to use general photo and hit upscale. Great. So we can actually flick between the two things here and see how good or how bad a job it did. Let's drag this in and see what the difference is like. Let's hide our GIMP layer. We'll invert this. And if we were to toggle this on and off, this is the result that we're getting. So even though it's kind of averaging out a few sections, I still think it's already doing a better job than just blurring everything out completely. And then we can throw a GIMP map on top of it. If you're still not happy with a lot of these weird edges, you could try things like liquefying and whatnot, and playing around with these sort of hard light or soft light effects. Let's try overlay for this one. Now we can still see that things aren't exactly lining up around the lips, but I think we should be able to get away with a lot of it. Now, because I'm really mainly using this for compositing, something else I like to do is just grab the original image. So I'm just going to remove the exposure thing we put here and masking the guy out. So I'm just going to speed things up here a little bit. Awesome. So what we can do is group our two normal maps together, and we'll put this guy underneath here. And let's apply this mask to our normal map layer. And we'll toggle these back on. And this is essentially what we're left with. I'm just going to duplicate that mask and whack it on this guy again. Cool. So now we've pretty much just got this guy masked out. We could go in with the mask and just sort of paint out these areas, but we're not going to do that for now. We're just trying to sort of isolate him so that we got something a little bit better to work with. So I'm going to drag this exposure adjustment onto our original dude up here, just so that we've got him nice and blackened out. And it's essentially now we have things set up exactly how we did before. But rather than just having our normal map and then applying procedural texture, we've got two normal maps in here, one for the main shadows and highlight, one for the details, and then a mask separating it out so that he is masked out from any background we choose to throw in there. So I'm just going to drag in another stock image, and we're going to put it in the very back just so that we've got something to sort of match the lighting to. I know that we already have a subject in this background image, so I want to try and not use them if I can help it. So let's just increase the size and kind of crop her out slightly. Great, maybe something like that'll do. It'll get the job done for this. So let's lock this background layer, and we'll lock this guy as well. And now what we want to do is with our normal map, we'll select that group, go to live filters, procedural texture, select this, single bump map lighting, and there we go. Now we can control the lighting however we want. Also, I should have pointed out, when you select this, there is single bump map lighting, which is the one that we've been using. There's also single bump map lighting negated Y, which is essentially the same thing. It just means that when you move this dial up to the top, the lighting will come from the top. And if you move it down to the bottom, the lighting will come from the bottom. It still comes from the right if you move it to the left, and still comes from the left if you move it to the right. So that's the difference between those two. It doesn't really matter which one you use. So what I want to do is, just going to switch back to the one I'm used to, probably have some sort of orange lighting coming in from this direction. We'll just decrease that brightness just a little bit. Great. Now remember, we want to set this to something like hard light. And we can continue to play around with that lighting until it's more in line with the effect that we are after. I think something about there looks pretty cool. And we can already see if we zoom in that even though it's not perfect, we're actually getting a lot more detail now. We're getting seams in his clothes, we're getting his hoodie string, we're even getting the edges of his glasses, which is awesome. So this is the beauty of combining the normal map from Gimp and the normal map from omnidata. Now remember, we want to also add on an adjustment, and we want to select Recolor. Make sure that Recolor is sitting above the procedural texture. So what I want to do is try and match the lighting kind of to that orange that we're getting from the sign. Great. And remember, we can play around with the saturation to try and match the saturation of the image. And also the lightness is really going to give you a lot of creative control over how much that spreads across the character. So I'm thinking something not too crazy, maybe about there. So yeah, maybe something like that. Now, of course, this is really blacking out the bottom of our image. So again, we want to go to blend options, and we'll just knock out the shadows of that completely. So yes, that does get rid of some of our lighting, but we can fix that by dragging in the highlights a little bit more. So just kind of averaging that out to where we want it to be. Now, I'm not really happy with the color of that I've chosen, so maybe we'll switch it back to be a little bit more yellow. Great, maybe something like that. Cool. So now we can actually duplicate this layer completely, and we'll just change the color to probably something more in line with this bluey tint that's happening over to the side there. Something like that. Great. Awesome. And now we'll shift this around to the opposite side. Now, again, if that's a lot, we can decrease the brightness here. And we'll just keep playing around with this recolor adjustment. Now remember, if you're not getting the desired effect that you want, just come back to your group and try playing around with things like soft light instead. So we can see that hard light and soft light give us very, very different results. Great. So I think that that's a really good starting point. You know, if we were to toggle this relighting off and our exposure adjustment, we've gone from something like this to making it underexposed and then playing around with the lighting a little bit more. So where do we go from here? Well, essentially now you've kind of got the lighting set up to be how you want it. Don't forget as well, you know, you could throw in another one of these if you really want to have him like lit a little bit more from the front, but we're not going to do that because I'm kind of rushing this at this point. So I'm going to group all of those layers together. And now let's apply some adjustments to this group. So for starters, we can see that the blackest parts of this image do not match the lighting level of this image. So we want to go up to something like curves. And we're just going to probably increase the level a little bit to probably something like that. Now again, if that's sort of lightening up the middle of our image too much, we can just sort of bring that back down slightly. It doesn't have to be anything too crazy. Something like that, or to get the job done. You can also try adding in a selective color adjustment on top of this. Of course, you could do this with the curves, but this just lets you control a few more things. So with the reds, we can tell it if we want it to have less blues in there. We can play around with the lightness or the darkness of it to really hone in that color matching that we're going for. I definitely find that this lighting seems to be a little bit more pinky sort of yellow. So just going to increase that a little bit. Could also play around with the yellows. Now, something else that this background image has that our imported image doesn't have is noise. So, I mean, you could add noise using the add noise filter here. I'll just drag it into that layer. If we increase the intensity, yeah, we can see that we are definitely adding noise. However, you need to make sure that you are masking it out, and you also want to be able to scale this noise. So you don't actually see what your noise looks like until you are scaled in at 100% in Affinity Photo. If we scroll down to this part of the image, and I'm just going to copy our mask from down here, and we'll drag that onto our noise layer. Scroll down here, we can see that the background image, being a lower pixel resolution, has a lot sort of larger bodies of noise than our foreground image. And the way to get around that would be to make a separate document and create a noise layer that way and sort of import it and edit that in. We're not going to do that today because we'll just be here forever if we do that. But we'll throw in a little bit of noise on this guy just to sort of at least bump it up just a little bit. Great. So again, you don't, like, obviously we're zoomed out pretty far here. We can see that the noise changes with every zoom. You do not see what your noise looks like until you are zoomed in at a level of 100%. So when you export your image, this is what your noise is going to look like. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to turn that layer off for now. We'll just turn it back on before we export. Now, something else that's really useful to do here is we'll just add in a new pixel layer. And I'm going to select a red brush and just drop the hardness all the way down to 0. Let's increase this. And just over the edges of his sleeve here, maybe the front there, maybe a tiny bit down here. We're just going to paint in some stuff. Now, it doesn't have to be too perfect. You could also come in and like Gaussian blur this slightly if you wanted to. We're not really going to do that. What we want to do with this layer is just select the color dodge method. Now we can see that some of our colors are shining through like that. So now let's just drop the opacity of this layer all the way down really, really low, and we'll just sort of increase it slightly. So we don't want this to be like anything too drastic, and I'm not really happy with how that turned out on the sleeve. So what I'm going to do is actually just drop the flow of this down quite significantly. Yeah, we want something a little bit softer like that, that kind of spreads out a little bit more. And this is just going to add in like a very subtle glow, mainly around these red highlights that we've painted on top of. So again, we'll select color dodge and then just drop the opacity to something that you really like. And now if we toggle this on and off, we can really see like it's very subtle, but just around the edges of his face here. We're getting like a little bit more of a glowy sort of highlight. That can really help tie the image together in a creative sort of way. But from here, this is where I would start applying adjustment layers to try and fit the two images together a bit more. So we've done all the work on this original layer. The background layer is as is. And so now we can come in and let's try things like applying a lens filter. We'll just make sure this is out on top. So just toggling that on and off. We can see that this makes our image a little bit warmer. We could increase this slightly if we wanted to. And we could play around with whether we want this to be warm or cool. Now, if you want a little bit more creative control over that, you could try creating a new layer and then drawing in a gradient of some sort. Maybe something like this. And we'll make one side of the image quite cool and make the other side quite warm. And then you can play around with your blend modes to sort of get the effect that you're after. Now, obviously, it's going to be pretty full on, but we're going to introduce this very, very subtly. Let's try overlay for now. I'll just decrease the opacity. Now it's kind of brightening it. I'm not really happy with that. Let's try and multiply it instead. So there we go. That's like a little bit more subtle. So now we can sort of use this gradient to let more of the warmth in on one side or more of the sort of cooler parts of the image in. So let's also throw in a curves adjustment. I'll just make sure that's sitting on top. I really want to emphasize these highlights. I really want to darken up the shadows just a touch, nothing too crazy. Maybe something like that. And one more color correction thing you could try is really emphasizing the yellow and red tints of those highlights and the more blue of the shadows. Again, this is going to be pretty full on once you apply it. But we're just trying to sort of average out some of these colors, and then we'll just drop the opacity and introduce it to a place that looks half decent. Those blues are definitely too strong in the shadows, so I'll just knock that back a little bit. I really don't like the angle that this guy is standing at, so I'm just going to tilt that slightly. We'll make him a little bit bigger. Just going to try throwing on a levels adjustment here and just increasing the gamma while also increasing some of these shadows just to help brighten up our subject slightly. And one more thing we can try is behind this guy, very similar to what we did before. We'll just take a brush and paint in some of these sort of redder highlights and whatnot, especially around the back here. Try switching this to color dodge. And then just slightly increasing that just to help him stand out a little bit more. If you're not happy with that, you can also try painting in like a sort of blue tint as well, but it really depends on like where your lighting is coming from. If there was a very strong blue light over to the right hand side here, I'd probably like paint in, you know, a lot more of this to help sell the effect a little bit better. But hey, it is what it is. And yeah, I mean, obviously you'd want to spend a lot more time on this and really help refine it. But at the moment, this is the best workflow I've found for doing something like this. Just to give you another example, here's a stock image I got from a stock photo website. It's the same guy we've masked out, a little bit better, but still pretty rough. Dropped the exposure, applied the normal map, and then started to really come in and control that lighting a lot more. So we can see that the light is coming from this direction, so we really want it hitting the left side of him. And then adding in glows and different effects, lighting the front a little bit more. And then just to sort of help sell everything, I've added in a few different rain effects. And if you look closely, these are pretty bad. Like, they're just some very standard brushes, and I even forgot to blur out this section behind him where it's hitting the ground and whatnot. But hey, it gets the job done, and it's really quite a fast way for just throwing together different photos and kind of photo bashing things. Obviously, like, you could just paint in a lot of this stuff yourself, but I feel like this saves a lot more time in the long run. Anyways, that's all I've got for you guys today. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that it proves useful to somebody out there. If you have a different way of doing this, I would definitely love to hear about it. Hit the like if you like, and if you don't, tell me why. Please subscribe, check me out on Patreon, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.